Nature Solutionaries is a podcast about conservationists who do amazing things for nature and bring inspiration into our lives. Southeast Asia is considered the region with the highest number of species facing immediate extinction. These species include iconic animals like orangutans or rhinos, but also lesser-known animals such as amphibians, fish, and reptilians. With over 80 critically endangered species, freshwater fish are currently the largest group of threatened species, and they will also be the subject of this episode. Yes, you heard that right, fish. Even though most people view fish as tasty food on their plates, freshwater fish are actually in desperate need of our attention and action. They are being threatened by pollution, aquatic habitat loss, invasive species, overharvesting, and water flow changes. Today will be my first time that I will talk about fish and more generally about why we cannot pump all the money into big animals but also invest into small species. It will also be the first time that I will conduct an interview with 3 experts, so let me introduce them and then we will get to the interview. My first guest is Nerissa Chao, a conservation biologist who has been leading the IUCN SSC Asian Species Action Partnership, so-called ASAP, which tries to help these threatened species. My second guest is Mike Baltzer, who founded Shoal, an organization that strives to protect the freshwater species. And my third guest is Nathaniel Ng from Mandai Nature, who is an expert on fish conservation. Nerissa, I'll start with you. Can you briefly explain why Southeast Asian region is critical for wildlife conservation and what Asian Species Action Partnership is trying to achieve?
So Southeast Asia is globally important for biodiversity. It's incredibly species rich and has a high number of regional and country endemic species. So this means species which are not found anywhere else on Earth. And amazingly, in this region, there are hundreds of new species which are still being discovered. So there's a vast wealth of biodiversity out there which we still don't know about. But the species in Southeast Asia are also facing serious rates of decline. There's a high number of threatened species in the region, and the biodiversity is really under pressure. So over the past few decades, we've seen significant land use change, and the region has some of the highest recent rates of habitat loss. Alongside this, unsustainable offtake of many wildlife species and other threats, which you mentioned in your introduction, are all driving species population declines. So the Asian Species Action Partnership was created to end species extinctions in Southeast Asia. It's a partnership platform which brings together over 200 organizations, and we focus on a subset of some of the most threatened species in the region. And these are species which are listed as critically endangered, and that means they're one step away from extinction. And we focus on the critically endangered mammals, birds, reptiles, amphibians, and freshwater fish found in the region. And we work to catalyze conservation action for these species, draw attention and bring resources to address the conservation needs of these species, many of which are not the large, charismatic megafauna you mentioned in the beginning, but often overlooked and lesser known species.
It's interesting. Now I realize that in over 1 year of doing this podcast, I've already covered 3 species that are on ASAP list: Saola, Delacour's langur, and slow loris. So yeah, today we'll be talking about fishes, and that's exciting. Mike, can you introduce Shoal and tell us why freshwater fishes are important for the ecosystem?
Yeah, sure. So I think you said a lot of it already in your introduction, and the reason why Shoal was set up. So I have a long history in sort of conservation, particularly in Southeast Asia, and one of the things that came up quite often with us was that freshwater fish there was just very little going on, and in fact very little known about the freshwater fish. So when we were always doing these assessments of where to do biodiversity conservation, where to focus our attention, we were always drawing a blank on freshwater fish, and this is something that's not just peculiar to Southeast Asia. It's something that's a pattern throughout the whole globe, and so we sat together with a number of different conservation organisations and also people that are interested in fish, such as anglers and aquarium hobbyists. And we made a decision that we need to set something up globally to change the situation for freshwater fish, because there are some organisations working on fish, and there's definitely many universities and zoos that contribute to it, but really there's very little attention to it, and there's not one sort of single organisation that's working on it. So we decided to set up the Shoal initiative, and the whole point of it really is to escalate the action for freshwater fish. And Southeast Asia is one of those key areas where freshwater fish are really suffering and need attention, and I guess we're going to talk about that more later. And freshwater fish are really important because they're sort of flagships and indicators of the health of our rivers and lakes and the wetlands across the world. So we quite often talk about wetlands, but in conservation we often talk about those species that are above the water, such as the birds or something going back again to the megafauna like dolphins and crocodiles and hippos and things like that. So we very often forget what's underneath the surface, but underneath the surface there's something like over 18,000 species of freshwater fish across the globe. They represent lots of different types of habitat. When we're seeing such extraordinary rates of extinction and also the numbers of threatened species, it's telling us something, that our relationship with these freshwater systems is breaking down, and it can show us indicate many different things. And fish are an essential part of that ecosystem, and what's very important to Shoal is that the fact that most people in the world are connected to a freshwater system somehow. Everybody's got a river nearby or a lake nearby, or so you can understand the sort of impact and the intricate nature between people and freshwater fish.
We're going to talk about the relationship that people have to fish, but before that, I would like to give space to Nathaniel to introduce himself and to tell us more about the work that he does for Mandai Nature, because he is a fish expert. So can you tell us a bit more about yourself?
Glad to. So first, hi everyone, I'm Nathaniel, as Veronica so kindly introduced. And I represent Mandai Nature, which is an organization. We are based in Singapore that's focused on Southeast Asia. And we are dedicated to protecting threatened species, nurturing healthy ecosystems, and supporting vibrant communities so that nature and people can thrive and coexist. And so freshwater fish have been identified again for us as well as a very target taxon, because they're so neglected, yet at the same time they're so important, right? I mean, like Mike mentioned, everyone is within close distance to a water body of some sort. Human communities rely on water bodies, and a lot of these ecosystems, these freshwater ecosystems, are being borne aloft, right, by freshwater fish, which generally are the largest animal group within them in terms of biomass. So they fulfill very, very important ecosystem roles, and the fact that they've been neglected for so long just does not bode well for the fish and also for us, right, as animals, well, as beings, right, that rely as well on all these freshwater ecosystems. So yeah, and that's why Mandai Nature chose to focus on freshwater fish. I mean, they're important, they're neglected, and like you mentioned, there's so many threatened species, so it just felt right that we should, do a lot of work on them.
All of you mentioned that in your introduction that fish are the most I mean, that fish get very little attention and almost no funding, and we know that they're the most threatened taxon in the world. So are there any volunteers to answer this question? Like, why is there so much resistance or ignorance to their protection when they're so threatened?
Yeah, so, maybe I can answer that. So, I mean, that's one of the things that Shoal's aiming to address. So, we have three objectives, and our first objective is to raise awareness and increase the engagement with freshwater species and freshwater fishes. And it really isn't. It's not about resistance. There's certainly no resistance to it. It's really about the fact that awareness. So if you're watching wildlife documentaries, it's quite often large animals in East Africa or jungles in Asia or Amazon. And so even when you have a program about the Amazon, it's usually about the trees or the jaguars, and it's not about the river itself and the fish within in the rivers. So essentially, we freshwater and freshwater species haven't had their moment. They haven't had their moment like save the tiger or save the rhino or save the whales or rainforest. And simply we haven't what we call the Jacques Cousteau moment, when someone's dipped their scuba mask underneath the water and exposed this world of wonder underneath the surface. So people who aren't really aware of it, and there are groups of people that are fully aware of it. The people I mentioned before, the anglers and the people in the aquarium hobby, they've got a wonderful fascination, and lots of people, local communities that live with river systems, they're aware of it. But globally, it's not something that had very much attention, and certainly people don't realise the incredible diversity and of fish around the world. And so it's really about that. So really about raising the awareness, and once you raise the awareness, that's when you get the engagement. So it's really that, and you're going to hear, like you mentioned, that over and over again how we talk about being overlooked and neglected. It's going to be the theme of this podcast probably.
Yeah, I mean, I would agree with what Mike says. I mean, it isn't sort of resistance as such, but just, I think more than anything, out of sight, out of mind. You don't see the fish. A lot of the freshwater fish, not all of them, some of them are incredibly beautiful, but there are many which aren't, they're not going to capture the imagination and the minds of people that, the tigers and the elephants do. And I think just as an example to illustrate this, in December 2020, 16 freshwater fish were declared extinct by the IUCN Red List of Threatened Species. These were species on their ASAP species list from the Philippines. And I'm sure you haven't heard of this. It didn't make the news headlines. Most people aren't aware, and they've just disappeared before any serious efforts have been made to try and avert their extinction. So as Mike said, we've come together to really try and change this and change the fate of these species, because they are incredible species and they do deserve the same level of attention and conservation action and focus as these other species.
The problem is that fish are considered non-charismatic. Like you said, that some of them are beautiful, some of them are less, and most people view them as a commodity. As I said in the introduction, they are seen as, food, or people go to see them in aquarium, although that's a good thing. But mostly people see fish as food. So is there a chance that we can change this attitude?
Yeah, well, personally, I think absolutely we can. So I think when you're talking about people's relationship with fish is generally because they're commodities, or in the supermarkets, or quite often, for instance, those are marine fish anyway. But really, people haven't had a chance to discover some of the incredible fishes. And you've got places like the lakes, Rift Valley lakes in Africa, that have hundreds of species of fish together. And it's just as beautiful and dramatic as with a coral reef, and the fish are incredibly beautiful. But people just haven't been exposed to it, and even though they're familiar, very familiar to people in the aquarium hobby, and it's just so. We need to start telling these stories, and we need to show examples of these fishes, and some of these fishes, and the fishes that are even on the list of ASAP that live in the Mekong. These enormous catfishes and enormous stingrays that are swimming in the Mekong. I don't think anybody has any idea that there's such an incredibly large fish living so closely to people in this river. So I think it's just a question of that we haven't been told that story yet, and I can assure you, if I could give you, 10 minutes to show you fish, that you'll get just as fascinated in them as much as you would be with orangutans.
I think that people might understand the problem of fish becoming extinct when they understand the consequences on the environment, on the ecosystem, and also on them. So what are the impacts of fish becoming extinct? Maybe Nathaniel can reply to that.
I'll be glad to. So the thing about fish is, like I mentioned before, they kind of form the largest biomass, right, within freshwater habitats and within all aquatic habitats, actually. And I mean, what this means is they fulfill many, many different ecosystem functions in each of these habitats. And this is across, all different trophic levels, right? Whether you're talking about, well, they're not primary producers, but they do eat primary producers. And then you have to, all the way up to the apex predators. These are all fish. And what happens when you have these fish being removed or extirpated from the system is then you get all these things that start to go wrong with the ecosystem, right? You get the nutrient flows are disrupted, the cycling is disrupted. You get all these things where all the other animal groups that live within the freshwater habitats are also changed. So there was a study recently done in Spain, for example, when they looked at, what happens in some of these sections of streams, where there was one particular species of fish called a Mediterranean barbel. So that fish went extinct in certain localized areas. And you had massive, massive, massive effects. And these fish are not even, they're not large or you won't look at them and think, oh, these are important. But the reality is that each of these fish species plays such an important role. And sometimes you know about it, sometimes we don't. But what we have observed through all these different studies is that once something happens, there's always a negative effect. And primary productivity, for example, goes down. And all these different things, given the number of species of fish, and again, how much mass they are just within the ecosystem, it really, really, helps to keep everything running. So, I mean, I'm sure you've heard also of, the cases where you get all these problems with runoff and then, so much nutrients, right, going into the water, and then you get algal blooms and all of that. If you remove fish, you will get pretty much the same situation, right? It has been observed also where you get invasives coming in, killing off the native populations, and you get all these algal blooms coming in, things getting poisoned. And I think it's very important to remember also that, all the terrestrial environments that surround the freshwater environment, they too rely on the freshwater. So it's going to be one of those things. If the freshwater goes because the fish are not there, then the terrestrial environments will also be very, very badly affected.
And very importantly, many animals depend on fish, right, for their food. So it will pretty much impact all the animals and the higher chains of the food pyramid. So it's all interconnected, and people often forget about it, unfortunately. So how threatened are fish in Southeast Asia compared to other regions? Is the situation of freshwater fish in Southeast Asia different to other parts of the world, say, I don't know, Latin America or Africa?
But perhaps let me take that sort of global perspective on, and then Nat can talk to you a little bit more about Southeast Asia. So globally, freshwater fish are threatened pretty much everywhere. And again, it goes back to that sort of relationship we have to our wetlands, to our rivers and our lakes. And the fact that we see them often as wastelands, or the places where we can dump our pollution or dump our waste. But there's many places in the world where the freshwater fish are threatened, and there's some places where there's very high levels of fish biodiversity, like Mexico or the Rift Valley lakes that I already mentioned, that are really are suffering in terms of species loss too. So it's something that's across the globe. Even Europe and the US, we're seeing a similar pattern, and that's a combination of neglect, but also of the relationship between wetlands and people, and the threats that the fish face. But in Southeast Asia, this is pretty intense for those reasons. And maybe Nat can talk about that.
So yeah, I mean, like Mike mentioned, this is pretty much a global problem. In Southeast Asia, population densities here are pretty high. So that, of course, when you get more people, you get even more effects, right, on the freshwater systems on which these people rely on. Southeast Asia has also got quite a lot of interesting habitats, some of which people would consider to be terrestrial habitats, but also which harbor a lot of freshwater fish. So the peat swamps, for example. These are, a lot of people look at them and think, they're forests, and they are, but they also are very, very important habitats for these radiations of fish that you cannot find anywhere else in the world. So when you think about deforestation, which, it's a huge problem in Southeast Asia, you're also talking about the destruction of all these water habitats that go together with the forest. Southeast Asia also has a lot of issues with invasive species, so we have a lot of we do have some ancient lakes, for example, and of course, in Africa you have this problem with the Rift Valley and all of that. We have similar situations here. So the 16 species that Nerissa was talking about, they come from an ancient lake in the Philippines, and a lot of that extinction was caused by some fishing, but also the introduction of other invasive species as food fish, which then go in and decimate the local fish species. So all of these things, they just work together, right? Which is why you get all these problems with Southeast Asian fish in general being so imperiled across all these different freshwater habitat types, across all the different taxon groups. So yeah, in Southeast Asia it's pretty bad, but the rest of the world is also pretty bad. So just fish in general really do need a lot of help.
What I draw from this is that the more people there are, the more they impact the environment and they make it worse for the fish, right? Like the population pressure is really high in Southeast Asia on these ecosystems, right? Is that what you were saying?
Yes, that is definitely a part of it. I mean, there are many moving parts in this puzzle, so that is one of the moving parts.
And it's not just the population pressure coming from within the region, but it's also the demand for commodities which are coming from outside the region. So a lot of the pressure on sort of peat swamp forests, for example, is coming from the demand for commodities such as palm oil, which is coming, from consumers globally.
Yeah, regarding palm oil, I've also done an interview about palm oil with a conservationist who works in Indonesia, and I've recently been really trying to remove palm oil from my diet, and it's so tough. Like when you look at all the candy, it's everywhere. Like all the best chocolates you can imagine, they have palm oil. I even contacted one fair trade company that produces chocolate because I was very shocked that they also have palm oil, because I wouldn't expect it in that company. But they replied to me, but I wasn't really satisfied. Like palm oil is everywhere and it's destroying the habitat so badly. It's really...
It's a very difficult discussion, I think, and it's not a sort of good-bad situation. We have to look at how palm oil can be produced sustainably as well, because it's a very efficient sort of vegetable crop to produce. So it's very complex, along with many of the other conservation challenges we're faced with today.
Yeah, and it would be probably a topic for another discussion. And today we're talking about fish. So Mandai Nature, Shoal, and ASAP are currently working on creating a conservation action plan for freshwater fish species. So how is this plan going to help protect fish in Southeast Asia? Nerissa, maybe you can start.
Yeah, I'll start from the ASAP perspective. In terms of ASAP species, freshwater fish actually make up over a third of all ASAP species. So there's nearly 100 freshwater fish which are listed as critically endangered in the region. And what's extremely worrying is that a third of those are actually listed as critically endangered, possibly extinct. And as it's been alluded to in the previous discussions, these species have been neglected and overlooked. And as Mike said, in a lot of cases, people aren't really clear exactly what needs to be done. So we've come together to sort of address this and recognize that there's a need to synthesize the available information there is and identify key needs and actions. And the idea is that this document will bring together sort of a variety of stakeholders, because to address this, it's not just the conservation community, it needs to go, much wider than that, and look at how we can catalyze conservation action to tackle this problem and identify sort of the most efficient ways that we can work towards protecting these species.
So what will this ASAP action plan be about? Can you explain it in simple words for the listener? Like, what's going to be in that document and how the document is going to change the situation for the freshwater fish?
Essentially, we have over 90 species that we need to deal with urgently. So we have to remember that when we're talking about ASAP species, that we're talking about the most threatened species. These are ones on the real verge of extinction, and so we need to act fast. So when you have 92 species that we don't really know much about, and there's not much people doing things on, we need to think about how do we sort of escalate that action pretty fast and make sure that the attention is given to these species. So what we've done with the plan is looked at all the different species and analysed each of the species, and this is the work that Nat's been doing, collecting information and sorting the information, and then we start saying, okay, how best do we tackle this? Is it best? Do we need to change the policies of all the governments in Southeast Asia? Well, that's going to be a tricky thing to do in the short term. So the way we've done it at the moment is we've broken them up by country, because usually the action will be undertaken by people in those countries, and their focus of attention will be in those countries. But we've also identified some actions that could be done across the region, and Nat mentioned, for instance, peat swamp fishes and the palm oil issue, and it's something. I don't want to say relatively easy, but it's something we can see that that there are solutions to, and we can take action. And many of these species are just found in very small, fragmented pieces of forest, but just nobody's looking at them because we're forgetting about the fishes underneath these trees. So we can take some topics and say, okay, let's focus on solving this one. So peat swamps is another one. Another one in the region. Peat swamp is these forests that are permanently flooded, and they create this massive layer of peat, and they have specific conditions. It's very acidic black water conditions that some fish completely love and rely on. And many of them are extremely beautiful, by the way, and many of them are kept actually by the aquarium trade. But they've spread mainly in Malaysia and Indonesia, and these are the forests that you see on the news burning. So when you hear about the smoke and the pollution, it's quite often these peat swamps because of peat catches on fire. But actually, for fishes, the conservation strategy is fairly straightforward. We just need to find those places and those fishes are saying, and see if we can just protect those bits of peat swamp, or even making people aware that these fish are there, because many people don't know that they're there. So that's one action we can take sort of across the region. But generally, it's really focusing mainly at each of the countries, and we've identified the topics that and the species that we need to be focusing on in those countries. So, for instance, you've got the Mekong countries. Many of the fishes are fishes related to the Mekong itself and the issues of migrants. So, your listeners can't see the picture, but behind Nerissa's head, she's got a picture of giant catfish that swim up and down the Mekong, and these are enormous fishes, and they need the full length of the Mekong to breed and to move up and down. But because dams are in place, they're not able to reach their breeding grounds. In fact, we don't even really know too much about where they breed and what's going on. So that's another example of something that we can work together. I mean, already there's quite a bit of work going on the Mekong fishes too, but there's so much more that we could do. So the action plan sort of divides up actions, identifies who's the best players, who needs to be focused on it. How do we best tackle this? So it's like, if your house is a big mess after a party or something, and you've got to work out who does the dishes and who cleans the carpet, etc. So it's just really just a question of identifying the task and seeing who can do it. And then the biggest issue is obviously going to be having to raise the funds to deliver on the action plan. And also the biggest challenge probably in the region is finding the partners and the people that can take the action, because we've got a long way to go before we have the capacity to tackle this issue. And that's a big challenge for Southeast Asia.
So basically what you're going to do is you're going to create this plan and then come to the people who should implement it and discuss with them. But and you are also going to raise funds, and you will give these funds to the people so that they can implement it, or how is it going to work in practice?
Well, yeah, you made it sound quite simple. So writing the action plan's relatively easy compared to the second parts of it. So the plan, the plan's being developed by all the experts in the region, and then we need to start promoting that plan and talking to the people that could be really delivering on the plan.
And those will be sorry to interrupt you, but those will be who, like people from the communities who live next to the rivers, or policymakers, or what kind of organizations will these be?
I mean, they vary obviously according to the challenge that they face, but very often, and this is quite characteristic of freshwater fish conservation, is that local communities, the people living close to those fishes, are the ones that can really take the action, but they're very far away from the action plan. And so we need to work in between. So either that we would be working with the government and saying we need to develop actions with these local communities, or very often it's working with an intermediary organisation like a conservation organisation that might be working in that region, and they will be supporting and working with the local communities. So one of the good things about Southeast Asia in terms of fish conservation, there's many organisations that work very closely with local communities, and they may have been doing that for other things like for primates or for and they're very keen also to turn their attention to fishes, and the skills that they've learnt over the years of working with local communities can now be applied to working with fishes. And actually local communities really do know how to, because they've relied on fish very often, it's usually very intimately linked with their lives. They know actually how to manage these fishes, but then they're not necessarily aware of the fact that these fishes are only found in the local river. It's making those links and helping to catalyse, and ultimately the issue is funding.
So very concretely, are you going to tell the people not to fish over certain, let's say, you will give them like limits, or you will tell them not to pollute the rivers? Like I would like to understand, like, very simply how this plan is going to translate into daily actions of the people who live by the wetlands.
I think at the end of the day, it really depends on, again, which species you're talking about and what the main threat is over there. So for a lot of the species, actually, overfishing has not generally been a huge problem, or at least now, right? Maybe in the past, it's what caused the species to, the species populations to plummet to this kind of a level. But for a lot of the critically endangered species, actually fishing in the modern day is not that big of a problem, right? So again, maybe it will not be about limiting catch because they're not even going after them anymore. But it could be things like protecting the spawning grounds, right? Or even finding out where the spawning grounds are, because for a lot of these fish, it's not even, properly known or documented where the spawning grounds actually are. When it comes to things like pollution control, of course, you will need to engage with authorities, to do with policy interventions would be required, but it really depends on which species and what fish we're talking about, which is also why it's so important for us to engage with so many different organization types, right? Different types of organizations, different communities, because at the end of the day, if we are really going to have an impact on these fish, we will need to be able to talk to many different kinds of people. Yeah.
Because in the introduction, I mentioned that there are different threats like pollution, aquatic habitat loss, invasive species, overharvesting, and water flow changes. So you will have to address a lot of issues, right?
Yes, a lot of them.
We have to address a lot of issues, but not all of them are impacting every single species. So usually each species has one or two of those challenges, and it's the solution. Certainly not telling people what to do is going to, and it's very rare in conservation that basically just telling people this is and restricting people to do what they want to do is the solution. So what we ultimately what we're doing is be working with the people that living with these fishes and finding solutions together about how they can like set aside that area for protection, or we can help reduce the pollution if it's a pollution issue that's coming into that area, or even if it is an overfishing issue, about how to then sometimes very often it's just an awareness issue that the local communities don't know that this fish is threatened. But I mean, we're making it sound a little bit easy. But some of these, so some of the issues are very large and quite difficult. So, I mentioned the Mekong migrants and the solutions to that, to finding how to deal with the impacts of hydropower dams blocking the mainstream of the Mekong. That's an enormous challenge, and that's something that's not going to be done by local communities. That's going to be done by working with the governments. And engineers and experts, and understanding the ecosystem of the fishes so that we can find solutions. So some of the challenges are huge. And another one is invasive species, for instance. So many of these lakes are the fishes that are found in lakes are threatened by invasive species. And quite often, and so in some cases that's because hobbyists have released their fish from their fish tanks into the systems. So that's something we can do. We can solve, or at least stop from now on through education and awareness raising. Sometimes it's about introducing food fishes. So Nat was talking about that earlier, where you deliberately introduce the fish because it's big and it's easy to catch and it's great for food, but then it has an impact on all the other fishes in the lakes. So we can also work with the governments about the policy of introducing fishes, and I think that's something that's sort of disappearing. But the biggest issue is that the fish are already there, so these invasive fishes are there, and finding a solution to that one is really tough, and no one really knows quite how to do it. So we're testing out ideas in some of the lakes. But ultimately, there's some challenges. So some things are really big and challenging, and it's going to be difficult to deal with. But in many cases, the solutions are local, and it's really about working in partnership with the people that live with it and know how to find solutions at that scale.
In the document about the action plan, I also read about some proposed solutions like ex situ management, restoring habitats, and migration routes. So can you elaborate on that?
In certain circumstances, well, as we mentioned before, these species are really on the brink of extinction, and in many cases we might not know what the solutions are. So quite often what we do in conservation when the situation's like that is to bring individuals into captivity and breed them in zoos, or in our case in aquariums. So this is quite common for other types of species, but for fish it's also a great solution because you can breed fish in captivity in large numbers and maintain a population. So that's one of the options that we have. And many of the fishes, we know how to breed them because they've been bred in the aquarium trade. So the expertise is out there, but the question is capacity, and how long do you keep these fishes in captivity for? So we've got the advantage that they're small. Well, very often they're small. We know how to look after them. There's many people that are quite keen to look after them. But the question is there any point doing that if the habitat's completely gone? And that's a big question for conservation. But quite often that's not really a question of that. It's basically saying, well, we may find a solution to the habitat in the future. For things like invasive species, we know, it's a good chance that we'll find a solution to that issue in the next few years. So if we have a breeding population in captivity that we can then reintroduce back into the wild, then we can restore and recover the populations. And this has been done for many different species where the species have been lost in the wild, and but fortunately we had an insurance population either in a zoo or aquarium, and quite often even hobbyists. There's examples of parrots, for instance, that were extinct in the wild, but fortunately some people have kept them as pets, and they then bred. It's a long process. It's not the cheapest thing to do in the world, but it's obviously an answer to so many of these species, and unfortunately for many of these ASAP species, this is one of the options that we should be definitely thinking about for them, because they really are on the brink.
And who would be breeding them? I mean, where would they be put? In zoos, in aquariums, or in some special centers?
Zoos and aquariums definitely have a part to play. As of now, the role of zoos and aquariums hasn't been what it should be. However, there has been quite a lot of interest recently, especially in zoos and aquariums, because a lot of these organizations are beginning to recognize the importance of all these freshwater fish protection. So this is up and coming. But what we also hope to do, and that has been actually quite powerful in some other parts of the world, is to actually harness the expertise and resources also of the aquarium hobbyists, so of people who love fish and who keep them at home. And this has been used really, really powerfully, for example, in the US not the US, more North America, right? Because the fish are from Mexico and all the way up. And these are fish called goodites, and they are actually being maintained very, very effectively by a group of hobbyists in this organization called the Goodite Working Group. So if you can have something like that for Southeast Asian fishes, it could go a long way in helping to take some of the stress off the zoos and aquariums when it comes to maintaining genetically viable populations. And this is also important because a lot of fish, if you keep them, if there's a very small founding population, you start having issues with inbreeding after a few generations. So fish start to have, they start to come out all deformed, or you have very, high rates of death when they're young. So what hobbyists can bring to the table, besides expertise, which they already have, is also all these extra tanks at home that you can use to maintain these larger captive populations that then safeguards the genetic variability of these species.
Okay, wonderful. That's definitely an interesting solution. Speaking of the species on the brink, Nerissa, can you estimate how much time do these 92 fish species have left in the nature if we don't act immediately?
I wouldn't really want to put a figure on. I think it depends very much on the different species. As I said, out of the group of ASAP freshwater fishes, there's already a significant proportion which could already be extinct, and sort of surveys and research to find out if those species still exist or not is desperately needed. There's also quite a number of fish on the list which haven't been seen for a number of years, some of them for over 50 years or longer. So there's fish which have been described even 100 years ago and then not really seen since, but also there haven't really been people out there looking. So I think there's a bit of a mixture with sort of the threats versus, the actual attention and focus. And so part of what we're trying to do is really raise that awareness, get the resources needed to have action happening on the ground. And hopefully we'll be able to turn things around and not lose more of these species.
So these 92 fishes are divided into kind of two groups. So one which were discovered but haven't been seen for many years. That's like a half of them, you said. And then the other that are critically endangered but have been seen, or maybe I got you wrong.
No, so they're all listed as critically endangered. So the IUCN Red List of Threatened Species sort of carries out assessments to assess the conservation status of species. So all of the species we're looking at under the ASAP umbrella are listed as critically endangered. But under that sort of conservation status, there's also ones which are listed as critically endangered and possibly extinct. So they're not being declared extinct yet, but there's a very high possibility that they are already extinct. And so out of the ASAP list, there's nearly 30 which are actually listed as possibly extinct. So it's a really, huge proportion. And so there does need to be some focus on determining whether these species still exist. But then there's also species which are not listed as possibly extinct but haven't been seen for a number of years. And in large part, that's because people aren't actually looking for the species.
So, for example, I was asking this question because when I was conducting an interview with Bill Robichaud about Saola, of course, you can never tell how much time the animal has left in nature, because there can always be some animals hiding. But if the population is so low, for example, under 100 individuals or even under 50 individuals, you need a certain sustainable population so that it survives into nature. So you could kind of estimate that Saola has these many years left. So in these populations of like, how big are the populations of these critically endangered fish? Like, do they have 20, 30 years or just 2 years because there are just two fishes swimming there of a certain kind?
For most of these species, we really don't have a good idea on specific sort of population numbers, but Nat can maybe give some more details.
Yeah, it's really tricky with a lot of these fish. So for some of them, you just, for quite a few of them, I remember the estimated population size is something between like 1 to 49. So for individuals, for species like that, it's going to be, they really do not have much time. For some of the others, where you get higher population numbers, maybe you will then, I guess, have a little bit more time, but it really also depends on a lot of other things, like some of the larger migratory fish, for example. The populations within the river are extremely imperiled. But you do get people kind of breeding them on the side in reservoirs and all of that. But it's at that point also you get into all these, complicated questions about, the reservoir fish, right? They've been kind of domesticated, or they've undergone a little bit of that domestication process. And the genetics are, of course, also different. So then would you really consider that to be the same as the wild fish within the rivers, right? So it's not always a very straightforward question to answer, I think. But I guess overall, it really would depend. For some of the species, it's extremely critical. And for some of the others, maybe you have a little bit more time. But even the ones for which you have a bit more time, given how they're all critically endangered, you don't really have that much more time. So yeah, these all just need really urgent action.
I think we're talking about freshwater fish, but we're talking about, over 90 different species which have very different biology and different threats that they're facing. And different habitat requirements and other issues. And so for some of the species which are very localized and maybe only found in single locations, if they do have a serious threat facing them, you can potentially have the whole population wiped out almost overnight. So it's very hard to kind of say as a blanket, for all the ASAP freshwater fish. But I think the key message is that, action is needed really urgently to avoid extinctions.
Yeah, let me just add a little bit. It's definitely not the same situation as a sour in most, where there's possibly just a few individuals, and those individuals might not even be meeting, and then you've got the issues with a small genetic pool. But one of the things we've done in the plan is also look at the feasibility of finding these fishes, and so the ones that are potentially extinct, we divided them into two things. One was called an active search for them and understanding, because we believe that's probably they've just been overlooked, or there hasn't been enough knowledge about the population, and so it's definitely worth going out and actively looking to where these fishes might be, and then there's some species that we put into passive search where we feel like they haven't been seen for 100 years, and a lot of these are found in Java, where there's such an intense, dense human population, and that is going to be the effort to find these fishes is going to be very difficult. So it's more about hoping that there might be some local people that university students locally that might have an interest to go and look for it, or but we wouldn't put it in the same pot as some of the other fishes that we need to raise money and put active investment into. But it's generally more about that rather than worrying about whether the population's got so small that the genetic pool's got too small, like for instance, Sala that you mentioned.
And speaking of the urgency, in which phase is the action plan? When is it going to be published?
We at the moment we're close to finishing the very first draft of it, and then the important stage is to get the consultation, with much wider consultation, and then that will also help us identify the priorities and sort of really say, okay, we've listed all these things, we've identified some of the priorities, but really what do we as a group of experts and a group of conservation people in the region think, like, this is what we really need to do first. So but generally the plan isn't because it's all such high priority, and the actions will be probably more or less spread out by country. There isn't really much scope for sort of saying this is high priority or this is low priority, but we can certainly do that. So we'll be doing that in the next couple of months, and then we're hoping to release the plan towards the middle of the year.
Okay, so around summer.
Yeah, the plan's actually taken us a lot longer than we hoped, because the normal way of doing these plans is bringing together a whole bunch of people into a room and discuss all the different species and bring our knowledge together, and facilitate a sort of, in a workshop setting, the action plan. But because of COVID, we've not been able to bring people together, and so that sort of process of planning and sharing ideas is much more difficult. So, but we're hoping to do that process now, virtually, online with the people that we need to talk to.
Yeah, COVID is messing up with everything. We were also supposed to do this interview like a couple of months back, but we are doing it now, and that's fine. Let's hope that the plan will be done and that you will be able to protect the fishes. One of my last question is, are there any efforts currently to protect the fish in Southeast Asia? For example, one of the fishes on the list?
Who's better? Let me have a go at that, and maybe Nerissa and Nat can jump in, because so in general, for going through the action plan, I would say that the vast majority of the fishes, there is no action going on at all for them. But certain fishes, there is some work going on. Very often the research is sort of more inclined towards research side. So, people looking, going into the field and understanding the sort of distribution of the fishes and what fishes might be in certain places. But even that's very scarcely done in the region, but I would say that out of all the species on the list, the ones that have had some conservation attention are probably those Mekong fishes, and there has been some work there's an ongoing project called the Wonders of the Mekong, for instance, which is really focusing on these very large, extremely large fish in the Mekong, and they're doing the beginnings of the work in terms of understanding of where these species are and what the solutions to conservation are. So at least those have got some investment, but very far from, I would say, still very far from what is required. There's some other fishes that have some attention. There's a group of fishes on the list that called the paraphomina. So these are the ones that are living in peat swamps. They're beautiful, tiny, colourful fish, whereby the hobbyists are the ones driving the conservation. So they're going out looking for these fish, identifying new species. This year they found 2 new species, and then trying to generate sort of funding and activity on the ground for different species. So, but I would say the vast majority of it, there's very little going on in terms of active conservations. And Shoal and ASAP are supporting projects for some of the fishes already. I mean, one of the things we should say is that the action plan, although it's not completely released and finished, the priorities and the actions are already pretty quite clear in them. So we're able to sort of begin already triggering and working with partners for certain species.
Thank you. Nerissa, would you like to follow up, or Nathaniel?
I think Mike covered most of it. I mean, the Mekong giants are probably the species which have had the most conservation attention up until now. A lot of focus around the fishes tend to be much more on the research or taxonomy side, and what we're trying to do is really bring in that conservation action element. So we're not just recording the decline and disappearance of these species, we're actually ensuring that actions are happening on the ground which stop those declines. And we're actively working to identify and support organisations who are looking at the conservation of these species. And we're hoping in the next year to be supporting a few projects on conservation action of fishes on the ground. So fingers crossed. And, a big part of this, as Mike said, is also bringing the donors on board and increasing the financial resources to support conservation action of fish.
Nathaniel, since you're the fish expert here, have you noticed any successful initiatives in protecting fish?
There has been some. So that group that Mike mentioned, the group that's working on paraphomines, they have actually had sought interest, right, from some other zoos. So I think Chester Zoo in the UK, for example, is now actively involved in conservation breeding of some of these fish. And also, importantly, there is the Taman Safari group in Indonesia is also, they are very actively taking a role in setting up ex situ breeding colonies of some of their peatland fishes. So these things are happening. They are definitely not at the kind of level that they need to be at right now, but there are efforts. Though a lot of them, they're kind of just starting, or they're quite new. But these things are the beginning, and they will hopefully continue on in the future and grow and help to protect these fish.
Exactly. Let's hope that there will be more efforts and more people engaged in fish conservation. And with that, I would like to thank all of you, Nerissa, Nathaniel, and Mike, for this wonderful interview. Thank you for doing this great work, and I wish you all the best in your efforts.
Thank you.
Thanks very much.
Thank you very much.
Thanks for listening to Nature Solutionaries. If you like this episode and think your network might be interested, please help spread the word on social media. And if you don't want to miss another episode, you can subscribe to the podcast in iTunes, Spotify, Google Podcasts, or Stitcher. If you enjoy this podcast, please write a review. This helps other people find the show and learn about the most important conservation efforts of today. For more podcasts, visit veronicaperkova.com/naturesolutionaries. I'm Veronica Perkova, and I look forward to talking to you soon.